Hi class, today we're going to do part 2 of the problem of evil, which is the real problem, the evidential problem. So before we get into that though, let's just briefly review some of the key concepts. Again, if this is fast, feel free to just rewatch the previous video. But generally, the problem of evil we sort into two. Both problems have to do with a tension between omnipotence, that is, ability to bring about any logically possible state of affairs, moral perfection, which is always praiseworthy and never blameworthy, and evil, which we define as any suffering. The worry is that an omnipotent being could prevent suffering, a morally perfect being would have motive to prevent suffering. However, when we work that out a little, we realize what you really need to do is isolate the key feature, gratuitous evil. Remember, gratuitous evil is the opposite of necessary evil. Gratuitous evil is any evil that is more than the minimum that is logically entailed by some greater good. So God could do anything to break a law of logic, so any suffering that is not logically entailed by a greater good is blameworthy. So gratuitous evil is always blameworthy. If there's a morally perfect being, that being is never blameworthy. As such, if there's gratuitous evil, there is not a God of theism, and vice versa. The logical problem just tried to show that God was impossible given evil, but that's not the more interesting discussion, since what is possible doesn't inform our beliefs anyway. If you recall, right at the end of part 10 of the dialogues, Hume basically, even though he doesn't believe it, Hume basically just stipulates, let's assume that the logical problem of evil can be solved, and let's talk about the real issue, which is the evidential problem. So remember, the evidential problem is inductive. It tries to argue that there is probably gratuitous evil. As such, there is probably no God of theism. And if you understand how belief works and how probability works, that should be enough. Probably no God means you should not believe there's a God. However, when we were working out the logic last time, remember what we said. Given that the theist has to say there's probably no gratuitous evil. This is the same as saying this is probably the best possible world, which is the same as saying God reducing any instance of suffering would probably make the world a worse place, which is also to say this is the amount of evil or suffering we would expect in a perfect creation. So all of those say the same thing. Those are all logically equivalent ways of saying there is probably no gratuitous evil, since the theist must say the first, must say the other three. So now we're to part 11 of Hume's dialogues. Here's what Hume is going to try to do. He's going to first draw out this commitment, try to draw out this is what a theist has to say, and at the same time try to convince you, the reader, that you should not have this belief, which means, of course, you should not be a theist if that's true. So Hume's going to do this through three different analogies. I certainly encourage you to take a look at those again in the readings, and also they're discussed in that IEP article in the announcement. But start with this claim that God reducing any instance of suffering would probably make the world worse. He gives the building analogy, or the architect analogy. So how does that run? Imagine that you are being shown a house by a real estate agent, and there's just flaws everywhere in the house. Screw-ups, mistakes, etc. So you point at, say, the doorway and say, why is that door frame crooked? And the real estate agent says, well, we could straighten out the door frame, but that would undermine the foundation for the second floor master bedroom. You say, okay. And suppose every flaw is like that. Every flaw is somehow preventing a much worse disaster. Hume's challenge here is to say, okay, given that situation, would you infer a perfect builder, a perfect architect? And if you answer no, think about what you just said, because the theist is basically saying that suffering in the world is like that. Well, if this suffering wasn't here, something much worse would happen. Even if that's true, I still wouldn't infer a perfect God or a perfect creator, says Hume. And so if you wouldn't infer a perfect creator just because the flaws have explanations, that means you think there's probably some gratuitous evil and shouldn't be a theist. Let's talk about the second analogy Hume uses is the visitor or stranger analogy. And this is the analogy he tries to use to draw out what the theist has to say in terms of this is the amount of evil we'd expect in a perfect creation. So Hume says, imagine a visitor, a stranger. And what's important about this stranger is that they are a stranger to our customs. What Hume's really saying in disguise is, imagine someone who hasn't had Christianity shoved down their throat since the day they were born. Imagine someone who's approaching all evidence fresh and unbiased, independent of background. And Hume says, take this stranger to our customs and show them around. Don't be biased. Show them the good as well as the bad. So for the good, take them to the opera, he says, take them to a nice wedding, et cetera, et cetera. But also show the bad. So take them past that factory that always smells awful. Take them to the burn unit at the hospital. Take them to the Holocaust Museum. And then suppose you told this visitor, as you're standing under the pile of dead children's shoes 5 stories tall, and say, and this world is the result of a perfect creator. And Hume's question is, would that visitor be surprised? It sure seems like it. But notice, as soon as you answer yes, you've just said, this amount of suffering is surprising given a perfect creation, which means there's probably gratuitous evil, which means you should not be a theist. The third consideration in terms of these analogies about the best is intended to bring about the best possible world. Because one of the important things that gets lost sometimes in these dialogues is that, remember, suffering's about degree. It's not just there's suffering or there's not suffering. We have to talk about more and less. And any suffering is gratuitous if it's a higher degree, if it's even slightly more than is necessary. So this is the relevant discussion where Hume talks about the 4 circumstances that are responsible for the most suffering in the world. As always, I would never ask you to memorize a list for the exam. Instead, what's important is their relevance. But let's go through the list anyway. So here's what accounts for most suffering in the world, says Hume, or Hume's Philo. 1 is that actions are motivated by considerations of avoiding pain. 2 is the fact that nature works regularly. So nature operates by general laws. So, well, when you drop a ball, it falls at 9.8 meters per second to the ground, but also when you drop an infant, it falls at 9.8 meters per second to the ground. Number 3, and these are not in the order Hume did them, by the way. Number 3 is that nature's cheap with its powers. So bears are immune to hypothermia. Humans are not immune to hypothermia, but they're clever enough to build houses. So, well, wouldn't it be better if humans were both clever enough to build houses and immune to hypothermia? Wouldn't that lead to less suffering? Etc. And then lastly, this is the one that it's a little trickier to parse out, but what Hume's getting at is that the same cause has both good and bad effects. So the rains that water the crops also flood the village. So Hume says these are the 4 things that lead to the most suffering. Okay, if we don't realize Hume's talking about the evidential problem of evil, it might be easy to miss the relevance in something really important here. Because it's about tweakability. So Hume's question is, does it seem like if you had an omnipotence wand, you could tweak any of those at all for slightly less suffering? So let me give an example. He says, look, nature operates by regular laws. Well, here's a funny fact. Did you know there's actually an equation that will determine exactly when you would die of hypothermia in the water? So it solves for time. There's a constant, and there's two variables, temperature of the water, speed of the water. You can actually die of hypothermia in 80 or 90 degree water if it's moving fast enough. Anyway, but there's that constant in there. And Hume says, well, if you had an omnipotence wand, couldn't you just change that constant a tiny bit, increase it by 0.1? And if you did so, fewer people would die of hypothermia. If it seems like the world would be a better place if you did that, congratulations, you just said there's gratuitous evil and you shouldn't be a theist. Because you just said this is not the best possible world. Or to take another one, there's a terrible genetic recombination disorder, I believe it's called Tay-Sachs, has 100% fatality rate, just really nasty and a lot of agony caused by genetic recombination. So here's a question. If you had an omnipotence wand and you were looking at the laws of genetic recombination, would you wave it to get rid of Tay-Sachs? Or put more forcefully, does it seem like the world would be a better place if we got rid of Tay-Sachs? If you say yes, this is probably not the best possible world, and therefore you shouldn't be a theist. So those are Hume's three analogies. They're made to draw out the theistic commitment and convince you that you shouldn't have it. At this point, we're finally done presenting the problem of evil, which means we're going to start looking at solutions. But I want to do an extended introduction to what you should be doing for the next lecture. So the next lecture has two things going on, the Dostoevsky and the theodicies. Those will be related, by the way. So first of all, theodicies. Remember that's a technical term, theodicy, for an attempted solution at the evidential problem of evil, which means, remember the theist has to say, there's probably no gratuitous evil. Another way of saying that, this is probably the best possible world. God reducing any instance of suffering would probably make the world a worse place, and this amount of suffering is expected in a perfect creation. Theist has to say those things. The theodicy's job is to make it seem that saying those things isn't crazy. The job of a theodicy is to try to explain why we should expect this much suffering in the world, why we would expect a perfect creation to have certain bad stuff. And so that's the theodicy's job. It can't change the theistic commitments, but the goal is to make the theistic commitments more plausible. Because if it's plausible that there's this much evil in the world, there's no problem. And ultimately, that's what theodicies are aiming at. One of your reading assignments for next time is to just Google some of the theodicies, come prepared to talk about them. The big three are listed on the review sheet, but we'll talk about some other ones as well. So look for them, familiarize yourself with them, etc. But the other thing I want to add is we're also doing the Dostoevsky reading. So I want to say a few words about that and how we're going to use it. So, first of all, it's I can't call it a fun reading because of the subject matter, but it is not it is not a philosophy reading. It is actually from Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov. In it, Ivan and Alyosha are arguing. Alyosha is a theist, actually a priest, and Ivan is an atheist. So those are probably some fun Thanksgiving dinners. But they're arguing precisely about the problem of evil. And Ivan is drawing it out with some pretty excruciating examples of suffering that happened to children. The fact that this is a work of fiction doesn't actually help there because all of these cases were ones that either Dostoevsky himself heard accounts of or were famous in the newspapers at the time, so the accounts themselves of the suffering are not fictional. You do not want to do this reading right after you eat. It's pretty gruesome. But here's the thing. Ivan is the atheist. Dostoevsky's not an atheist. Dostoevsky is a theistic philosopher, which means he knows exactly what he has to commit himself to when it comes to the problem of evil. However, he's an intellectually honest theist, which means he's going to discuss these commitments in depth and also kind of talk about implicitly what it would take to have a successful theodicy. It can't just explain evil, it has to do so in a way that it preserves ethics, and that's something we'll talk about a little more next time. So the way we're going to use the Dostoevsky reading, in addition to really drawing out some of the suffering and what the theist has to say, is to start thinking in terms of what it means for a satisfactory theodicy to happen in terms of ethics. So that's what we will be doing next time. Make sure to do your work before you watch the video. You'll get a lot more out of it. Otherwise, we will see you then.